plenty of room. Find yourself a seat. All sitting happy? I'd like to take you back to 1940. Here the Blitz started. If you lived in our street, you'd be in here. Night after night, we was all in it together.
This exhibit is the closest we can now get to the Blitz. But even here at the Imperial War Museum, it's become a comfortable part of the heritage industry, like so much of the Second World War. The myth is of everybody pulling together, old and young, rich and poor, London can take it, business as usual, smiling through. But the reality was very different indeed. When the German bombing campaign started in earnest in September 1940, it increased social distinctions and brought Britain to the very verge of class warfare. There had been plenty of warning. Since the end of the First World War, it was widely recognised that the next war would be fought in the air. Predictions about the catastrophic effects of bombing were terrifying. For the first time, the entire civilian population would be targeted in the very houses they lived in. And without a major shelter plan, everyone was at risk. So the public knew that Hitler would attempt to bomb Britain into submission. And in consequence, the demand in our great cities for deep communal public shelters was urgent. After all, Hitler had provided his people with huge communal shelters, but here in London, by 1940, no such precaution had been taken. In short, the government had made no realistic provision to shelter the ordinary people. So when the Blitz began on Saturday, the 7th of September 1940, the public was a sitting target. London was blasted. 430 people died and 1,600 were seriously wounded. The attacks soon spread to Bristol, Plymouth and the south coast. On the 25th of September, over 140 people died. The raids were to continue and worsen, and less than a year, 40,000 civilians died. There was nowhere to hide.
I was on an 88 bus coming home from Mitcham, where I'd been down to visit my sister who lived there, and coming up through Balham just before the stop, the siren started and the bomb, you could see the planes coming over. You could almost see the swastikas, as it were. It was really, really frightening. That was the time I can really remember feeling petrified. And I ran down the road towards my house, and there were some people standing at the gate because you could see the flames of the bombs. And I was out of breath running, and these people very kindly said, "Don't run on, come in here."
Do you think the sort of shelters that were provided were really adequate for the sort of threat?
Well, nothing was adequate for a direct bomb. Nothing.
The public was running out of patience. The government had to react fast. But instead of improving shelter arrangements, it decided on a propaganda campaign showing the rich and fashionable dancing the Blitz away in safe basements of hotels and nightclubs in London's West End. East End victims of the Blitz were outraged by this. On the 15th of September 1940, a group of protesters marched to the Savoy Hotel and demanded shelter. The police were called, but in the confusion, an air raid warning sounded. The protesters were offered shelter by the hotel, and they headed for the smart basement room with a cocktail set sheltered. This is the Lincoln Room, the location of the Savoy's own makeshift shelter. Here, it offered its guests protection, as was demanded by the law, and provided them with games, beds, and entertainments. Unlike the public shelters, it was civilised, safe, and sanitary. Seeing this confirmed suspicions that the government was giving the public a raw deal. But safe shelter was the right of all citizens, rich and poor alike. Such was the level of public anger, the King and Queen were booed when they toured the East End. The strength of feeling was now so intense, even Queen Elizabeth felt the threat to social cohesion. After Buckingham Palace was bombed in September 1940, she commented, "I'm pleased it's been bombed. It makes me feel I can look the East End in the face." And just as the people had marched on the Savoy, they now stormed London's tube system. Defying guards, people seized the platforms, and soon huge crowds occupied all the deep stations in central London. As bombs rained down, people fled to platforms like this at Aldwych Underground Station, where they slept on the ground, over the tracks, with no water, no lavatories. But soon, the government was forced to make a U-turn, and it legalised sheltering on the tube. It was a massive victory for the people. The tube quickly became London's biggest air raid shelter. Its platforms and tunnels offered nightly protection to over 130,000 people. If one station was full, they would simply jump on a train and go on to the next station. They would even sleep in incompleted tunnels like this that had been built between new stations. But the battle for shelter was not won. The tubes may have been safe, but they certainly weren't civilised.
When you hear these people talk about the wonderful times in the bomb shelters and that, don't believe it. The trains were coming in, people were getting out. Remember that there was 4 bodies lying here, maybe 5, only a little way to the edge, so that you were never at home. It was nowhere to relax. People in those days only washed, maybe bathed once a week. The body smells, the smoking, everybody smoked. Woodbines, pipes. They used to turn off the air machines to save electricity. So you had a pungent, terrible, it was like being in a deep mine somewhere.
And what about the lavatories down here? How's that
They would be
organised?
just up against the wall here.
Yeah.
They'd have an iron bucket full of chemicals with a seat on, and then a Hessian screen, wooden screen with Hessian around it. That would be it. You'd hear every body function imaginable. And then, of course, late in the night, when the drunks started to use it, occasionally they would knock it over, or a fat lady would sit badly and it would go over. Then it'd be all over everywhere.
What about ordinary kind of family life down the tube? Presumably, I mean, people just...
Well, everything carried on. I mean, as a young man, you learnt a lot about life. You learnt a lot about sex. People carried on just as though they, once they were under that blanket and they'd had a couple of drinks and it was 2 o'clock in the morning, it was all happening.
Sanitation was a recurring problem. Even in one of the few large official shelters, the public suffered horribly. It was known as Mickey Shelter, named after its warden, the diminutive Mickey Davis. Remarkably, the East End basement shelter survives, empty and untouched. Mickey's shelter had been readied before the Blitz to receive 2,700 people. But, as Mickey later wrote, 10,000 terrified and confused bodies had squeezed themselves into this space.
Into this underground hell on the night of September the 7th, 1940. I fled out of an air raid that was making the streets untenable. I felt as if I'd run headlong into a stinking wall of ammoniacal fumes, of stagnant urine mingled with the sweat of almost putrefying humanity. Men and women were hysterical. The feeling of fear could be seen like a fog, starting from their eyes.
But out of this chaos, Mickey Davis created order. Within these cavernous spaces, blast walls were built to form sleeping compartments, bunks and a first aid station were installed. And Mickey even persuaded Marks and Spencer to donate cooking equipment to the canteen. But, most important of all, the shelter was run along democratic principles. This was truly a triumph of ordinary people looking after themselves. Although much improved by Mickey, the shelter at basement level was no safe solution. The Café de Paris basement ballroom took a direct hit in March 1941, killing 34 people and injuring 80. And even tube stations people thought so safe were vulnerable. Bank, Balham and Bounds Green tube stations were bombed, killing 140 people. The greatest tube disaster happened at Bethnal Green on the 3rd of March 1943. The siren sounded and hundreds of people tried to force their way onto this underground station, panicked by gunfire and by a fear of falling shrapnel. It's said that a woman tripped here, and within 90 seconds, 173 people were dead on this landing, crushed against that wall. This was a false alarm. These people were not killed by a Nazi bomb, but were victims of their own government's failed shelter policy. But the carnage of the Blitz could have been avoided. Little known to most people, before the war had even started, Finsbury Borough Council, one of the most forward-thinking councils, drew up an inspired programme of civil defence. Sadly, all that remains of the scheme is a couple of drawings. Designed as 15 massive concrete underground spirals, the shelters would have held 7,500 people each and could have been fully occupied within 7 minutes. But the government refused to support this scheme and nothing was ever built. But 4 years later, the government finally ate its words. Around the capital, strange structures began to appear. In a complete reversal of policy, the deep shelters had at last arrived.
Some of London's deep air raid shelters have been opened to the public, and the public has readily availed itself of the many advantages they offer. There are 8 of these underground homes from home, 4 in the south and 4 in the north. They're all built near tube stations, and each shelter has double-decker tunnels 1,400 feet in length. Everything possible has been done to make them really comfortable. There are canteens to keep the shelterers supplied with hot drinks and light refreshments.
At last the government had bowed to public pressure, but it all came too late. By the time these deep shelters were completed at the end of 1942, the Blitz was over. But they survive as memorials to government complacency and reminders of what might have been. The Goodge Street shelter is 120 feet deep, with 2 spacious tunnels which could hold up to 8,000 people. Other tunnels accommodated lavatories, kitchens, and first aid stations. Conditions were much improved, with good sanitation and revolutionary technology. Astonishingly, the futuristic mercury arc rectifiers used to guarantee a steady power supply still survive. It is a monumental and deeply impressive exercise. This is what people wanted all along. If deep shelters like this had been built before the Blitz, then perhaps thousands of lives would have been saved. The fact they weren't built must represent one of the great tragedies of the Second World War, and we've simply forgotten all about it.